Hello, and welcome to Nostalgic Medicine, where we take a look at fascinating stories about the history of medicine and healthcare. In today's video, we're going to go through the history of medical cannabis. So this substance has many different names: weed, marijuana, pot, ganja, hemp, and so on. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to refer to it as cannabis. Whenever anyone brings up the question about whether this drug should be used as a medicine or not, it sparks a lot of controversy, ranging from people who outright condemn it and say it should never be used, to those that say it's a revolutionary substance that has potential applications in multiple branches of medicine. And I know that many neutral observers from the outside will certainly be confused, as they're constantly bombarded with headlines like these which suggest that cannabis could be the miracle cure for many conditions that doctors have struggled to treat. But what is the truth? Does cannabis have a place in mainstream medicine? Well, today, I want to make things a bit clearer and hopefully give you an answer to this question. And to do this, I want to show you how cannabis was used in medicine historically, followed by how it declined and resurged in the 20th century, and then finally whether there are indeed any medical conditions that cannabis does work for. So to start off with, we need to go through some baseline information about what cannabis is. The best way for me to summarize its history is that cannabis has been used for four main functions: recreational use, religious, medical, and industrial. Obviously, as a doctor, this video will mainly be focusing on its medical use. When we talk about cannabis, we're referring to the two main species of flowering plants with their Latin names indica and sativa. These plants contain over 100 compounds known as cannabinoids, and these act on your body by binding onto cannabinoid receptors, which are expressed all over your body, but especially in your brain, nervous system, and immune system. Of all the compounds, there's two particular cannabinoids in cannabis that are the most abundant in the plant and have sparked the most interest. The first of these is THC, which is what's mainly responsible for giving you that high or stoned feeling. And the second compound is CBD, which is not psychoactive, but can interact with not just cannabinoid receptors, but also things like opioid and serotonin receptors. Medicinal forms of cannabis today either contain a combination of THC and CBD, or just one of them alone. So it might surprise you to hear that the cannabis plant is first known to have been used as a medicine in China all the way back to 2700 BC, and pretty much every single corner of the planet has used it as a medicine in one way or another throughout history, with this map illustrating when each region of the world first used this substance. As I mentioned earlier, the cannabis plant acts on so many areas in the body, and as you expect, the physicians of these past societies were able to apply a large range of different uses for cannabis, and I want to give you a few examples so that you could appreciate just how useful cannabis was. In China, cannabis was and still is known as one of the 50 fundamental herbs of Chinese medicine, and it was used for things such as vomiting, fever, pain, and as an anesthetic agent. In fact, the Chinese word for anesthesia literally translates to cannabis intoxication. In India, the cannabis plant was considered to be sacred by many and was used in religious ceremonies, but it also had several medical uses there, such as for anxiety, to stimulate hunger, and to treat epilepsy. And finally, this is a picture of Avicenna, the most famous and influential doctor of the medieval Islamic world, and he recorded cannabis as being useful for things like gout, wound infections, and severe headaches. So as you can see from these examples, cannabis was accepted as a treatment basically everywhere in the pre-scientific era of medicine around the world. This wasn't as much the case in Europe though, and although European doctors were well aware of cannabis and its medicinal properties, it wasn't actually used that much in Europe before the modern era, but it eventually would be accepted into Western medicine from around 1839, and this was thanks to an Irish physician called William O'Shaughnessy, who after visiting India, he saw for himself how useful the plant was, and when he returned home, he published a paper called On the Preparations of Indian Hemp, or ganja. O'Shaughnessy would be the first person ever to apply a scientific approach to researching cannabis, and he did this by testing it successfully on animals like mice and dogs, and then he found that it was effective on his patients. O'Shaughnessy is most known for successfully using cannabis to treat the violent muscle spasms that happen in severe tetanus, which at the time had no cure. Thanks to the work of O'Shaughnessy, there was a golden age of cannabis between 1839 and the early 20th century, where it was one of the most popular drugs in Western medicine, and was even in many medical textbooks and encyclopedias, meaning that all doctors would have been educated on what it does and how to use it on your patients, which from my personal experience, isn't the case anymore. So I've given you the first few thousand years of the cannabis plant being a very widely used substance that seemed to be effective for a very wide range of medical conditions. So you might be wondering, why did it decline? Well, the first reason for this is that medicine simply became more advanced. You see, despite cannabis being effective for many medical conditions, no one actually knew exactly how the plant was able to exert its effects, and scientists repeatedly tried and failed to isolate the chemical components of this seemingly magical plant. And because the individual component of each cannabis plant was slightly different, doctors found that the same amount of a cannabis plant had wildly different effects on different people, which is the exact opposite of what a doctor wants when trying to reliably treat their patients. So this meant that when other drugs came into popularity around the early 20th century, they quickly replaced pretty much all the use for cannabis. Aspirin was better at treating fever and inflammation. A tetanus vaccine and antibiotics were developed, so the use of cannabis was redundant for it. And the direct injection of opium with the newly developed hypodermic needle was a much more effective way to relieve pain than inhaling or swallowing the cannabis plant. And the final nail in the coffin for cannabis came around the 1930s, when countries around the world began to make cannabis illegal, a move that was led by the United States. The reason why it became illegal has been debated and researched endlessly, but the consensus was that it was a mix of two things. Reason one was racism against Mexican and African American communities which regularly smoked cannabis, because people feared that it would make the majority white population quote-unquote degenerate and violent if recreational cannabis spread to white people. The second reason was due to political lobbying and pressure from the nylon industry, because hemp was seen to be a competitor to nylon, as both of these materials had similar uses. Like I said, a very controversial history of how it was banned, but regardless of the reasons for it, cannabis was now officially a Schedule 1 drug in America, meaning that it was deemed to have a very high potential for abuse and no possible medical use, which flies in the face of everything I've mentioned so far in this video. And this meant that no one was even allowed to do medical research on it anymore. But if you know how every single war on drugs went, then you won't be surprised to hear that this law failed to eliminate the use of cannabis, and it only continued to grow worldwide. In fact, by the 1970s, around half of Americans claimed to have tried the drug at some time in the past, which was up from only 5% in the mid-1960s. As you might expect, this increase in cannabis use brought about some renewed medical interest in the substance, especially from doctors in countries where they were allowed to research the drug. And this would lead to doctors in Israel finally succeeding in isolating the main active ingredient in the cannabis plant, THC. So this now means that we can give a precise concentration of the cannabis compounds rather than just praying and hoping that we got the right dose. From there, we eventually found out that there's a whole system inside the human body that is designed to respond to cannabinoids, and that we even make our own endogenous cannabinoids, meaning that thankfully, the potential for cannabis and its constituent compounds to be used as a medicine was once again realized after essentially being forgotten about for over 50 years. So what is cannabis used for now? Well, the honest truth is, not that much at the moment. And this is because it still remains illegal in many countries around the world, and clinical trials on the drug are still prohibited in many places. But this is slowly changing around, and many countries and indeed American states have started to relax the laws on it and allow research, and as of today, there's a handful of medical conditions which cannabis is indeed a proven treatment for, and some countries do allow your doctor to prescribe cannabis for them. Examples include pain associated with nerve damage and cancer, vomiting, and some forms of epilepsy. It's important to note that cannabis is far from the first-line option for any of these conditions, but maybe with more research, it might eventually become a more popular choice in medicine for these conditions and many others that might be on your mind. But please, don't take these proven indications as a justification to be able to take cannabis if you have something like neuropathic pain or vomiting, because cannabis is a drug, and I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but it does have potentially serious side effects. These include things like associations with lower cognition, psychotic illnesses, preterm birth, possibly some respiratory cancers, and paradoxically vomiting in the long run. But don't get me wrong, I have absolutely no problem with people using cannabis recreationally, as everyone should have freedom of choice, and making it legal will make it open to medical research, and for doctors to finally know once and for all what it does truly work for. But my advice to anyone who wants to start cannabis for medical treatment is to only do it under the careful supervision of an experienced doctor who is able to weigh up the pros and cons of this drug.